Picture yourself standing in the shadow of the Forbidden City, its crimson walls stretching endlessly beneath a pale, watchful sky. It is the early years of the Qing dynasty, and behind those heavy gates lies a world few will ever see but many will whisper about in fearful reverence, a gilded prison where the emperor's absolute power shaped every heartbeat, every breath, every fleeting hope. In this hidden realm, there were men who were not quite men, boys who never fully became men, and a hierarchy so precise that even a wrong glance could cost a life. They were the palace eunuchs, the imperial servants, the so-called male concubines whose bodies and identities were traded for access, favor, or survival. Before we step deeper into these shadows, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What hour of the day or night keeps you company as we open these hidden doors together? If stories like this stir something in you, I'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing, but only if you truly want to keep walking these forgotten corridors with me. In the vast sweep of Chinese history, the institution of the eunuch reaches back over 2,000 years. From the Han to the Ming, the Qing, and even further back to the Warring States, the logic was brutally simple. A man cut off from his lineage could be trusted with the secrets and women of the palace. His loyalty, in theory, would belong solely to the throne. But this tidy justification glosses over the human cost. And within this system of eunuchs existed a more secretive, unsettling role. Young boys and men who became intimate companions to emperors and high-ranking nobles, bound not only by duty but by flesh and the cold calculus of pleasure and power. Imagine a boy of 10, perhaps the son of a poor farmer whose land has failed him for a third harvest in a row. An imperial recruiter arrives in his village, promising the father that his son will live within marble walls, wear silk robes, eat rice and pork every day instead of millet and wild greens. A family burden turned into a blessing. No one speaks of the knife. No one mentions the ceremony, crude, secretive, and carried out in courtyards behind closed doors. The boy is led away in the early dawn. He does not look back because his father cannot bear to meet his eyes. When he arrives at the capital, he finds himself among dozens, sometimes hundreds of other boys just like him, wide-eyed, terrified, stripped of family name and future legacy. The procedure itself is a thing whispered about even now, centuries later. In the Qing era, the operation was performed hastily by low-ranking palace officials or freelance cutters who traveled from village to village. A wooden block, a small knife, a gourd of wine or vinegar as the only anesthetic. A heated stone pressed against the wound to stop the bleeding, or if the family could afford it, a pinch of herbal paste said to prevent infection. Survival was not guaranteed. Some boys bled out on straw mats. Others developed fevers that lingered until they slipped away in the night, forgotten before the sun rose again. Those who lived carried their new status like a brand. In the palace, they became taijian, literally great attendants, yet they themselves were reduced to shadows, neither fully trusted nor entirely despised. They were indispensable and reviled, powerful yet powerless, drifting on the whims of the throne. Not all eunuchs were expected to serve the emperor's bedchamber, but among them, the youngest and fairest sometimes did. These favored companions, whom foreign observers might bluntly label male concubines, occupied a space between servant and lover, object and confidant. Their value was their pliability, their beauty, their absolute vulnerability wrapped in silken robes and ceremonial rank. In many ways, they were more than concubines. They were mirrors for the emperor's whims and appetites, tokens of control to be displayed or hidden as palace gossip demanded. The imperial court was a place of ritual and hierarchy, but beneath the lacquered surface seethed 1,000 private bargains. An emperor might select a boy to keep him company during the endless banquets, the opera performances, the sleepless nights when paranoia grew teeth. The boy, in return, received fine clothes, good food, perhaps the chance to send coins back to the family who traded him away. But the cost was steep, endless surveillance, the constant threat of intrigue, the certainty that when the emperor tired of him, he might be dismissed, disgraced, or worse. For centuries, rumors swirled of emperors who kept entire hidden chambers of these boys, tenderly raised, meticulously dressed, taught music, poetry, and subtle arts of conversation and seduction. They were expected to appear delicate yet obedient, silent yet responsive to the ruler's every passing mood. Historical records hint at the Hongwu Emperor of the Ming, who distrusted women so deeply that he kept only a handful of official wives but surrounded himself with loyal eunuchs. Or the notorious Ming Emperors Zhengde and Jiajing, whose private chambers became rumor magnets for courtiers and foreign envoys alike. They whispered of imperial favorites bathed in rosewater, of boys made to sing lullabies until the emperor fell asleep draped across their knees. But to call them concubines, as we understand the word today, is only partly accurate. They were not wives or partners. They were living ornaments, chosen for the pleasure and reassurance of the man who sat on the dragon throne, the Son of Heaven whose word bent mountains and rivers alike. They endured not only the loss of their bodies as nature intended, but the steady erasure of self. Their laughter, their smiles, their gestures were rehearsed performances, their own desires irrelevant in the hush of palace corridors echoing with the rustle of silk and the soft patter of slippers on polished stone. Yet within this system, some boys learned to wield subtle power of their own. An imperial favorite might whisper in the emperor's ear, tilt the balance of a rivalry, plant a suspicion that could blossom into a purge. He might accept bribes to plead a minister's case, or betray secrets when the tide turned against his benefactor. It was a perilous dance. One slip, a rumor, a jealous rival's whisper, and the favorite could vanish into the night, smuggled out to the outer courts, stripped of silk, reduced to scrubbing floors until the day he died, nameless among 1,000 others who once believed they could become more than shadows. Yet even in disgrace, a former favorite might cling to tiny remnants of privilege. Some found ways to barter the last scraps of influence they possessed, arranging discreet meetings for officials who craved access to the emperor's private thoughts. Others faded into the maze of the Forbidden City's back halls, where thousands of eunuchs, scribes, and menial servants lived stacked atop one another like nesting boxes, an entire hidden city within the city, pulsing day and night with secrets that would never be written in official annals. Step further into the labyrinth of red walls and whispering corridors, and you will find that survival here was not simply a matter of obeying the emperor's whim. It was a daily test of endurance, a ceaseless negotiation between humiliation and fleeting privilege. For the boys chosen to share an emperor's private hours, the cost of that fragile favor began with the transformation of their bodies but did not end there. What was taken by the knife was only the first wound. What was demanded afterward cut deeper still. In the Forbidden City, the daily life of a favored eunuch or male companion was bound by rigid ceremony. Each morning began long before dawn. Servants padded silently through stone courtyards still heavy with night mist, bearing trays of fine robes, powdered herbs, and scented oils. The boy would be washed, perfumed, and dressed by older eunuchs whose own power often rested on how perfectly they presented the emperor's favorites. A wrong fold in a silken collar, a smudge of rouge out of place, and a rival might seize that tiny flaw as proof of unworthiness. Appearance was not mere vanity here. A boy's value lay in the illusion he offered, youth preserved, innocence performed endlessly for a man who ruled millions yet trusted no one. The favorite's face became a painted mask that concealed fear, fatigue, or longing for a life left behind in the dusty courtyard of a village far beyond the city walls. Many were trained to sing or play the guqin, to recite poetry or respond with laughter at just the right moment, weaving the emperor's moods into threads of comfort and delight. But even the softest silk could not cushion the sharp edges of palace life. Older eunuchs, some veterans of half a dozen reigns, resented the sudden rise of these fresh-faced companions. They watched for any misstep, a slip of the tongue, a secret letter smuggled to a family, a single coin pocketed from a bribe meant for the emperor's ears. A whisper to the wrong official, a rumor carried like poison through the corridors, and the favorite might find himself dragged from the warmth of the inner chambers to the bleak, rat-haunted outbuildings where disgraced servants swept ash from braziers and emptied the night-soil jars. Beyond envy, there was the constant threat of intrigue from within the emperor's own household. Empresses, consorts, and high-ranking wives saw in these boys a threat more insidious than any rival concubine. A woman could bear children and secure her family's power, but the favorite eunuch could steal the emperor's private hours, fill the silence of restless nights, and gather secrets that no wife could ever hope to hear. Many an empress's family rose or fell on whether she could bend these invisible rivals to her side or destroy them quietly before they grew too bold. Some mothers of future emperors learned this lesson well. Records from the late Ming speak of palace women who plotted to remove favored boys by accusing them of witchcraft, theft, or conspiracy. The punishment for such crimes was swift and pitiless, a quiet strangling in a side courtyard or the more humiliating fate of public execution outside the palace gates. Even the highest-ranked eunuchs, should they fall too far from favor, could be flung down like broken chess pieces, stripped of rank, fortune, and name in a single breath. Yet to outsiders peering through the layers of rumor and guarded chronicles, it seemed at times that these boys held real power. Some did, for a moment. A well-placed word, a soft hand brushing the emperor's sleeve, a tearful plea offered in a private garden. These small performances could shape great decisions. The building of a temple, the exile of an official, the appointment of a governor in a far-off province, all might hinge on the hidden conversations that unfolded in chambers lit by flickering lanterns and scented with imported incense. Foreign envoys who glimpsed this secret realm often misunderstood it entirely. Jesuit priests sent to the Ming court reported with scandalized fascination that the emperor sometimes preferred the company of delicate-faced boys to that of his wives. Portuguese traders whispered tales of entire wings of the palace reserved for these living treasures, rooms where paintings of blossoms adorned the walls and the air was heavy with the scent of sandalwood and powdered tea leaves. Some envoys thought these boys wielded influence equal to prime ministers, never guessing that beneath the silk and gold, there remained one slip away from ruin. For the boys themselves, the rewards of favor were often as suffocating as the punishments for falling out of it. Privilege meant never leaving the walls. Food arrived in gilded dishes, yet freedom was a rumor they could barely remember. They might be dressed in robes finer than any scholars, yet each stitch reminded them they could not produce sons, could not pass on a name, could not exist outside these red walls. They were living reminders that in the imperial court, even the most private pleasures were bought with the destruction of bloodlines. Sometimes, one of these boys would grow bold enough to test the limits of his fragile power. He might send secret messages to his birth family, smuggle coins or silks through a trusted guard, or use his influence to rescue a brother from conscription. These small acts of rebellion were dangerous beyond measure. If discovered, they brought ruin not only on the boy but on his entire clan. Land seized, fathers flogged or executed, mothers forced to beg at temple gates for the rest of their days. So each smile was a calculation. Each word spoken in the emperor's ear was measured like gold dust on a merchant's scale. And each night, when the lamps were snuffed and the vast palace fell into silence, the boys who survived lay awake on silk pillows, eyes open to the painted beams overhead, wondering which passing moment of favor would be their last. Imagine the hush that settled over the imperial court as dusk descended, lamps flickering to life along endless corridors, shadows stretching like ink across lacquered floors. Within this hush, another world stirred, a hidden procession of boys being prepared for the gaze of the Son of Heaven. To understand the daily horror of their existence, one must see how they were chosen, shaped, and displayed, how the simple act of survival became an ordeal that stole not just the future from these boys, but the past they once called their own. The first step was always selection. Families rarely volunteered sons without desperation pushing them to it. A failed harvest, a debt too heavy to repay, an elder sibling's crime that needed atonement. These were the small tragedies that made a boy's body worth more to his kin unwhole than whole. Sometimes village elders were ordered to provide a quota. Sometimes unscrupulous brokers combed the countryside, looking for boys with smooth skin, fine features, and no blemish that might offend the emperor's eye. Once chosen, the boy's name was the first thing to vanish. New registers wrote him into the palace rosters as one of many, just another shadow among thousands. His family name was recorded only for the sake of confiscating the household's promised reward: bolts of cloth, silver tails, a bag of rice to quiet the neighbors' questions. Then, like a sapling forced into an unnatural shape, the boy was remade to suit a role he never chose. Older eunuchs, survivors of decades at court, oversaw this transformation. They ordered the boy's hair to be cut and coiled into elaborate styles that mimicked those of imperial concubines. Powder was pressed into his face to soften sharp lines of bone. Eyebrows were shaped to create an impression of gentle obedience. His voice was trained to rise just a note higher, softer than the command of a soldier but clearer than the giggle of a child. These lessons were not whispered comforts. They were drills, repeated until the boy's own laugh felt foreign on his tongue. Ritual cleansing was another step in this remaking. Ancient court etiquette demanded that any human who might share a ruler's bed be spotless, free from the dust of the world outside. Bathhouses built deep within the palace walls became silent theaters of this ritual. There, rows of boys knelt shoulder to shoulder in steaming pools while older eunuchs scrubbed their skin raw with cloths dipped in perfumed water. A single blemish, a scar that might offend delicate sensibilities, could mean rejection and return to the outer courts, where a failed concubine might sweep ashes until he was old, hidden from the eyes that once judged him beautiful. Once cleansed, they were dressed in silks so thin they clung like mist to skin. Brocade sashes were tied just so, sleeves brushed and adjusted until no crease betrayed a careless hand. Some boys were made to wear delicate earrings or ornaments in their hair, tokens of favor, but also reminders that their bodies were no longer truly their own. In the hush of these dressing chambers, they learned the first lesson of palace survival. The illusion of perfection must be absolute, because within these walls, perfection was power. When the emperor wished to choose, these boys were paraded like prized falcons at a noble's hunt. There were no grand halls filled with applause and clapping fans, just quiet pavilions screened by silk panels, moonlight pooling on polished floors. A wordless gesture might summon a boy forward. A slight tilt of the ruler's head could decide whose life would be transformed and whose would remain buried among the palace ranks. An emperor's glance could lift a boy from obscurity to the inner chambers, where he would be fed delicacies he had never tasted and sleep on embroidered pillows that once belonged to favored consorts now long dead. But this fragile elevation brought no promise of safety. The same glance that raised him could banish him without warning. A single cough, an ungraceful bow, a frown at the wrong moment, any of these small human failings might seal his return to the silent ranks of the faceless. To the outside world, these boys seemed to live surrounded by unimaginable luxury. Visitors glimpsing them behind silk screens saw only fine robes, fragrant hair, and the easy grace of youth. But beneath the surface lingered a ceaseless dread. They were watched not just by the emperor but by the entire court, rivals who noted every gesture, spies who whispered any slip to those hungry for scandal. The older eunuchs, who once shared their bathhouses and taught them how to speak, now became their harshest judges, enforcing rules that could shift with the winds of rumor and suspicion. Perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that for these boys, there could be no aging gracefully. Time itself was their greatest enemy. A face that once brought favor might wither too quickly under the stress of constant performance and quiet fear. An illness might leave a mark that no powder could conceal. When a boy lost the bloom of youth, he lost his worth. Some were quietly reassigned to distant palace offices, never again to see the bright lanterns of the inner chambers. Some disappeared altogether, rumored to have been sent to monastic outposts or hidden estates far from the capital, displaced so that no lingering reminder of faded beauty could stain the ruler's carefully curated world. Yet a few, the cleverest or most fortunate, found ways to survive these shifting tides. They cultivated alliances not just with the emperor but with ministers, court ladies, and powerful eunuch cliques. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to appear fragile and when to reveal a cunning hidden beneath layers of silk and painted smiles. For some, these skills bought decades of quiet power, a small kingdom carved out within the vast machinery of the court. But even for them, the price was steep, a lifetime lived behind masks, a soul trained to bend and bow until it no longer remembered what it felt like to stand upright. Step softly now, deeper into the maze where lanterns burn low and power flickers like a candle in a draught. By the time a boy survived his first seasons in the emperor's private world, he understood that beauty alone would not protect him. To last longer than the bloom of his youth, he needed to become more than an ornament. He needed to become a vessel for secrets, a broker of favors, and at times, a silent blade wielded in the dark. Among the imperial eunuchs, there rose a thin layer of cunning survivors, those who had once warmed the ruler's pillow and learned that knowledge could buy what delicate skin could not. These men, no longer boys but not yet old enough to fade into harmless obscurity, carried stories in their sleeves like hidden daggers. They remembered which minister had whispered treason after too much wine. They knew which concubine's child truly belonged to which father. They understood the fragile network of bribes that kept officials loyal and which rumor, if dropped like a stone into a still pond, could drown an entire family overnight. In the Forbidden City's vast hierarchy, where even a glance could be interpreted as ambition or betrayal, these once favored boys could wield influence equal to that of high ministers, if they were careful. They drifted through the maze of silk screens and lacquered doors, arranging discreet meetings between the emperor and petitioners who could never hope for an audience otherwise. They received gifts in secret, stacks of silver hidden beneath layers of embroidered robes, priceless scrolls slipped into chests that no guard would dare search. But with power came risk. A slip of the tongue could birth an accusation of corruption. A rumor of disloyalty could grow teeth overnight. The same courtiers who lined up to offer bribes one day might denounce their secret brokers the next, hoping to prove their own innocence by sacrificing yesterday's accomplices. No matter how clever, no matter how cautious, the shadows always shifted, and no favorite ever truly stepped beyond the reach of those who saw their power as a threat. Sometimes, their downfall arrived not by accusation but by a shift in the emperor's heart. A new boy, younger and more captivating, might catch the ruler's tired eye, pushing the old favorite into a quiet eclipse. The robes remained fine, the attendants polite, but the summons stopped coming. A few lingered, trying to reclaim favor with carefully chosen gifts or whispered flattery. Others recognized the final curtain when it fell and slipped away to new quarters at the edges of the palace, their influence dissolving like mist at dawn. Yet for a rare few, the curtain did not fall so easily. Historical records, though guarded, hint at eunuchs who rose to heights that startled even seasoned bureaucrats. Under the late Ming, figures like Wei Zhongxian loom large in rumor and fact alike, a palace servant who began as an unnoticed shadow and ended as the most feared man in the empire. He knew how to bend the throne's loneliness to his advantage, offering flattery, companionship, and a promise to carry out commands no official dared to utter aloud. Wei and others like him operated an invisible court within the court, a web of spies, informants, and minor functionaries who owed him everything. Petitions crossed his desk before they reached the emperor's hands. Promotions and demotions turned on his whispered counsel. Those who defied him found themselves accused of crimes so severe that entire clans vanished from the records overnight. Foreign envoys who visited the Ming and later Qing courts often returned home bewildered by this hidden power structure. They wrote of emperors surrounded by hundreds of eunuchs, many nothing more than obedient servants sweeping corridors and carrying messages. Yet among these shadows moved men whose soft voices could sway the fates of provinces, who commanded secret police forces, and who decided which truths the ruler would hear and which would never reach his ears at all. But behind every triumph lay the same brutal truth. The empire had no use for old favorites. When an emperor died, whether by illness, conspiracy, or sheer exhaustion from the weight of absolute power, his court shifted overnight. The new ruler often purged the shadows that clung to the old reign. Loyalists were banished or executed, wealth seized, families implicated. A once powerful eunuch might wake one morning to find imperial guards at his door, his carefully guarded secrets now worthless in the harsh light of new ambition. There were stories, too, of desperate attempts to cling to influence. Some sought to bind themselves to the next generation, offering counsel to the new heir or ingratiating themselves with his tutors. Others bribed court scribes to rewrite histories, to cleanse records of inconvenient truths that might mark them for punishment. A few fled altogether, slipping out of the Forbidden City in disguise, hoping to live out their days in some distant province where no one would recognize the faded finery of a former palace favorite. Yet even freedom could be cruel. Many who escaped found the world outside unkind to shadows who once bathed in luxury. They had no wives, no sons, no family name worth reclaiming. Stripped of silk and hidden influence, they became curiosities at best, suspicious vagrants at worst. A few opened small temples, claiming piety as a shield against gossip. Others vanished into the countryside, their graves marked by nothing but wind and passing rumors. For the boys who never rose so high, whose names were never written in court records or foreign reports, the end was quieter but no less grim. When their youth faded and their value waned, they drifted to the lowest ranks of the palace staff, tending gardens, repairing shoes, boiling water for the endless laundry of a city within walls. They passed one another in the corridors with downcast eyes, each recognizing in the other the ghost of a promise once made and long broken. Follow the flicker of the palace lamps now, deeper still, to where the marble halls give way to soot-darkened kitchens, draughty storerooms, and the shadowed back courts where the empire's discarded treasures lingered unseen. If the story of the male concubine began in silken chambers scented with sandalwood and jasmine, it often ended here, among ash buckets, cracked basins, and the low murmur of men who once carried secrets in their sleeves but now carried nothing but old bones and fading memories. For every eunuch who rose to wield influence, 100 more drifted through their years as nameless attendants to the household of the Son of Heaven. Some had spent a brief season in the glow of imperial favor, favored for a few restless months of the emperor's youth, a novelty soon replaced by another boy whose face seemed fresher, whose voice pleased the ruler's restless mind just a little more. When the emperor's interest waned, the dismissal was wordless. The silks remained, but the summons did not come. The next dawn found them reassigned to lesser duties, tending incense in the shrine halls, scrubbing lacquered floors until the wet stone bit their knees raw. In the vast machinery of the Forbidden City, even these minor roles mattered. Thousands of eunuchs labored unseen to keep the illusions alive, lighting lanterns by the hundreds each evening, tending endless gardens meant to evoke eternal spring, guarding locked storehouses where foreign gifts lay piled in dust-covered splendor. But for the former favorites, the bitter knowledge was that their hands once traced the emperor's sleeve in a private garden, and now they scraped rice pots clean at dawn alongside the same men who had once envied them. Punishments for the faintest defiance could come suddenly and without mercy. A careless word to a younger servant, a whispered complaint overheard by a rival. These small rebellions reminded the palace that a man stripped of power might still dream of claiming it back. Such suspicions were dangerous luxuries in a place where envy and fear worked together like blades in the dark. So the older favorites learned silence. They moved quietly through the service corridors, heads bowed, voices low, hands folded when addressed by those who now held the ear of the emperor. Even their once delicate manners became burdens to hide. Some wore plain sashes where once they displayed embroidered silk. Some learned to smear ash on their faces when passing through public halls, a disguise against the recognition that might provoke questions or scorn. Yet in this hushed twilight there flickered small, desperate embers of ambition. Some former favorites sought to buy influence from the shadows. They would approach trusted cooks or laundry stewards, bribing them with coins saved from secret gifts or pilfered scraps of imperial silver. Through these petty alliances, they hoped to carry news, what the emperor said, who he summoned, which rival families whispered behind screens about rebellion or scandal. Tiny threads of rumor woven together into fragile nets that might, if fortune turned, raise them once more from the dust. But the palace was a hungry thing, and it devoured such hopes swiftly. The penalties for being caught smuggling secrets could not be bargained away. A quiet death by silk cord, or worse, public disgrace in the outer courts, forced confessions that spread like rot through any small circle of allies a man had managed to gather. The message was always the same. The palace could raise a boy to unimaginable heights, but it could drop him deeper than the gutter from which he came. And for many, the end did not come as a punishment but simply as time's slow, indifferent closing of the door. An older eunuch who once wore jewels and perfumed robes now found himself bent over garden beds, pruning plum trees for spring blossoms that would be admired by men and women who never even learned his name. His joints ached in the winter cold, his vision blurred under the harsh sun of summer courtyards, yet still he rose before dawn like any other palace hand, because within these walls, there was nowhere else to go. Outside the Forbidden City, beyond its red ramparts and dragon-guarded gates, the world had moved on without him. Few families welcomed back the shadows they once sold to the court. A man with no heirs could not reclaim land lost generations before. A brother's children might smile politely at an unfamiliar uncle, but behind closed doors they whispered about curses and bad luck. What house would prosper with a eunuch's ghost walking its halls? So most stayed. They lingered in the corners of the city like discarded furniture, their lives measured in bowls of rice doled out by the palace granaries, in blankets handed down from younger men who still held the emperor's eye. Some found tiny comforts, old friendships with other discarded favorites, secret tea circles in dusty backrooms where stories of past splendor were traded like coins. They laughed together in low voices, pretending for a moment that the echo of silk sleeves and painted lips had been worth what they lost. Sometimes in the final years, an old favorite might volunteer to serve at the palace's ancestral shrines. There, in incense-thick halls where tablets bearing the names of emperors long dead lined the walls, they performed daily rituals, bowing, lighting sticks of sandalwood, muttering prayers for rulers who no longer remembered them. The irony never escaped them. They had once tended to the flesh and blood emperor, whispering secrets in moonlit gardens, and now they murmured invocations for his ashes, forgotten by the very line of kings they once helped comfort through restless nights. Yet perhaps the deepest cruelty lay not in the ritual or the labor, but in how ordinary their suffering became. The empire rolled forward. New emperors rose. New favorites were chosen. The court scribes scratched fresh names into the rosters, always the same cycle: selection, favor, envy, decline, oblivion. And somewhere in the shadows, the old ones watched the cycle repeat. Boys led trembling into the palace gates just as they had been, unaware that silk and sweetness could turn so easily to ash and silence. Beyond the red gates of the Forbidden City, beyond the neat courtyards and gilded beams, the empire itself turned on gears that few subjects ever truly saw. Officials traveled on horseback with stamped orders bound in silk. Merchants carried grain and salt across rivers that stretched like veins through the countryside. Scholars penned their careful memorials to the throne, pleading reforms, praising virtue, warning of corruption that threatened the mandate of heaven. But beneath all this ordered surface, a quieter, stranger power pulsed, one bound not by rank or title but by secrets spoken behind screens at midnight. Though the male concubines themselves rarely set foot outside the palace once they were chosen, their shadows reached far. They became conduits between the inner chambers and the wider world, an invisible bridge across which bribes and favors flowed like tea poured from a porcelain pot. To an ambitious official, the word of a favored boy could mean the difference between a provincial post on the empire's cold frontier or a plum appointment near the capital's warmth and wealth. To a wealthy merchant, a whispered promise from a palace intimate could ease taxes, secure trade monopolies, or silence a troublesome rival. Historians would later write these transactions down as rumors, hints in the margins of more respectable chronicles. A suspicious rise in a junior official's rank. A sudden building project funded by donations. A noble family stripped of its land in a single edict that arrived unsigned but carried the weight of imperial authority. Always, somewhere in the shadows, lingered the suggestion that a soft-spoken boy in silk, once a bedfellow, once a confidant, had turned the emperor's ear when all other doors were closed. Foreign envoys saw only glimpses of this hidden world and often failed to grasp its depth. Portuguese traders in the 16th century wrote of the strange men in fine robes who drifted behind the throne, who never spoke aloud in the audience halls but whose presence could shift the entire mood of a gathering. Jesuit missionaries sent reports back to Europe describing how impossible it was to reach the emperor directly without first winning the favor of these quiet figures. They called them eunuchs, sometimes understanding, sometimes distorting what that word meant in China's complex palace life. They rarely dared call them what they often were: intimate companions whose power rested not just on their proximity to the ruler's private moments but on their survival in a court that balanced desire with suspicion, loyalty with silent threats. These foreign scribes spoke with unease of how the empire's moral code bent itself around this hidden arrangement, how a ruler revered as the son of heaven might trust no minister, no general, no empress, more than he trusted a boy whose body had been sacrificed to the crown's lonely hunger. Yet outside the Forbidden City's walls, ordinary people often knew more than they let on. Rumors crept into the tea houses and village inns where travelers paused on their journeys. Peddlers carried gossip along with silk and porcelain, stories of emperors whose palaces overflowed with delicate boys dressed in robes softer than a noble lady's veil. Stories of ministers who fell because they offended the wrong intimate, stories of fortunes built overnight by merchants who slipped silver into the hands of a palace intermediary and found the tax collector suddenly silent. For villagers whose sons had vanished into the imperial machine, these rumors were sharp with bitterness. A father might stand at the edge of a rice paddy and remember the child he had surrendered, told that his sacrifice would bring favor, that his name would be honored in the clan tablets for generations. And what returned? Often nothing. No letters, no coins, no word at all. For most families, the boy might as well have drowned in the palace moats, his name spoken only in cautious whispers when the family gathered to burn incense at New Year. Yet for all the resentment, there was also awe. The peasant who bowed his head when an official's cart rattled past knew that somewhere far away, a boy from a village like his might be the true reason that official rose so high. A merchant who watched over his ledgers by candlelight knew that the letters stamped with the emperor's seal might have been shaped by a conversation spoken not in the audience hall, but in a hushed chamber scented with sandalwood and rose oil. Power did not always ride through the main gates in broad daylight. It could slip past curtains on slippered feet. Some of these palace shadows left more tangible marks behind. The wealth they gathered in secret bribes sometimes reappeared in unexpected places. A temple built in a remote province bearing an inscription funded by a humble servant of the Dragon Throne. Land quietly bought and entrusted to distant kin under false names. A bridge rebuilt after floodwaters washed it away, paid for by donations that never quite matched the official records. Even after they were gone, stripped of favor, vanished into nameless corners of the capital. Their invisible signatures lingered in stone and timber, an echo of influence that outlasted the silken pillow and the painted fan. And yet, for all this hidden power, the empire's moral guardians, Confucian scholars, moralists who wrote treatises on virtue and filial piety, spoke of these relationships in half-phrases, cautious to name what they could not fully condemn yet dared not praise. They insisted the Son of Heaven must be a father to the realm, that the line must continue unbroken, that loyalty and family were the empire's foundation. And still, behind the red walls, the emperor's nights were often kept warm not by empresses chosen in grand ceremonies but by the boys whose names history rarely bothered to record. Stand now at the fading edge of the Forbidden City's long shadow, where the old certainties began to crack beneath the weight of a changing world. As the centuries turned and foreign powers pressed at China's locked gates, the delicate machinery of palace life, with its hidden corridors and silk-bound secrets, shuddered under new pressures. Yet even as cannons thundered at coastal ports and treaties were signed in smoke-filled rooms, within the crimson walls the old cycle remained. Boys led in through side gates at dawn, names struck from family registers, lives given over to serve a throne that claimed to stand unshaken beneath heaven. By the late Qing dynasty, the empire's final centuries bore witness to a paradox both tragic and darkly enduring. On the one hand, Confucian moralists grew ever more vocal, penning fierce essays denouncing corruption, moral decay, and the hidden excesses of the Forbidden City. On the other, behind closed doors, the old ways clung to life with a stubbornness that no proclamation could truly banish. Imperial decrees limiting the number of palace eunuchs came and went, ignored in practice, rewritten with every new reign. Where there was a ruler isolated by the vastness of power, there would always be those ready to trade youth and silence for influence and fragile comfort. The European emissaries who arrived in the mid-19th century brought with them an unsettling curiosity. They peered through palace gates and took careful notes of what little they were allowed to see. Some left records of the grand, empty courtyards where a single emperor might stand surrounded by a sea of bowing officials, while behind him, silent as ghosts, the attendants and favored boys lingered just out of direct sight. Some envoys described how rumors of scandal found their way even into foreign dispatches. Whispers of boys dressed in embroidered robes, their faces powdered, kneeling at the foot of the Dragon Throne when dusk fell and the business of empire gave way to long nights of isolation. Foreign scribes often misunderstood what they glimpsed. Some imagined harems of boys hidden away like the more familiar consorts and empresses. Others assumed every eunuch was a concubine, blind to the vast, grinding ranks of ordinary servants who had never stepped foot near the emperor's bedchamber. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the quiet grey spaces between rumor and record. What is certain is that by the dynasty's last century, the line between servant, lover, and conspirator blurred in ways that left deep scars on palace politics. One need only look to the figure of Li Lianying, a name that even the stiffest court chronicles could not erase. Rising from obscurity, Li became the trusted shadow behind the Empress Dowager Cixi. He began, like so many before him, as a minor palace eunuch, one boy among thousands. But he learned quickly how to bow deeply without bowing his will. He rose through the ranks by tending not only to the palace's hidden needs but to the shifting moods of its most powerful occupant. Whether rumor exaggerated his role or not, foreign journalists of the time marveled at how a man who owned no family name could hold the keys to the empire's final days. What men like Li knew, what every boy who once bent his knee in a moonlit chamber learned, was that the Forbidden City ran not only on official edicts but on whispers traded in the hush between dusk and dawn. The favors granted to those intimate enough to share the ruler's restless hours often decided which official survived an intrigue, which merchant ships sailed free of taxes, which general commanded an army when rebellion flickered on the borders. And when that delicate favor soured or shifted, the ruin came with equal speed. As the dynasty staggered into its final decades, these once invisible hands found themselves caught in the storms that blew in from far shores. The old imperial machine struggled to hold together under foreign demands for trade, for territory, for tribute masked as diplomacy. Rebellions burned in the countryside. Secret societies plotted in tea houses and temple courtyards. The palace walls still gleamed red beneath the northern sun, but within, their once immovable rituals began to crack under the weight of new ideas: republicanism, nationalism, calls for modern armies and modern minds. For the boys who remained, those still chosen from villages by desperate fathers, still remade in the echoing courtyards where the cut was made without ceremony or witness, these larger storms changed little at first. They still bowed to the emperor's command. They still wore fine silks they did not own. They still traded secrets for coin, played at power behind silk screens, and counted every dawn as a small victory against being discarded in the cold. Yet in these final years, the world beyond the palace began to see them differently. Reformers and foreign journalists alike held up the hidden life of the eunuch system as proof of imperial decadence, a symbol of how the old ways devoured their own sons to feed the illusions of eternal rule. The very rumors that once wrapped the Forbidden City in mystique became weapons used to shame the throne, proof that an empire ruled by shadows and whispers could not survive the iron steamships and foreign rifles waiting beyond its gates. And so, as the dynasty fell and the last boy emperors played at power while grown men plotted revolution in the streets, the old cycle sputtered and wheezed but did not quite vanish overnight. Even when the imperial system finally crumbled in 1912, and the dragon throne stood empty at last, thousands of palace eunuchs, some once favored boys, now gray-haired ghosts, still drifted through the abandoned halls. Some stayed on as caretakers for empty pavilions. Some wandered into the new Republic streets, strangers to a world they had never been free to know. They carried no heirs, no legacy but rumor and half-remembered secrets. They lived out their final years in the shadows of tea shops, temple courtyards, or hidden rooms in the old city's crumbling quarters, living reminders that for centuries, power behind red walls came not just from armies or scrolls of law, but from the quiet, terrible bargain made in secret, a boy's future offered up so that an emperor's nights need never be lonely. Stand with me now in the hush that lingers long after the last lantern has been snuffed out. The Forbidden City still rises in the heart of Beijing, its roofs gleaming gold under the same sun that once warmed emperors who believed themselves the center of heaven and earth. Tourists pass through its gates in endless lines, gazing at gilded halls, painted dragons coiled above ancient thrones. But the boys who once slipped through its hidden corridors leave no monuments behind, only faint traces, ghost stories folded into dusty records, rumors that drift through the courtyards when dusk settles and the air grows cold. When the last emperor stepped down, Puyi, a child emperor forced to grow old in exile and uneasy memory, the old world that had devoured so many lives did not vanish at once. The eunuchs who had once guarded the gates of the imperial chambers, tended the flickering lamps, and warmed the empty silken beds found themselves suddenly unmoored. Some stayed on as caretakers, roaming the Forbidden City's endless rooms like living relics, polishing jade ornaments no one would wear again, bowing before empty thrones that no longer commanded legions. A few tried to return to villages they barely remembered, carrying only a name that no longer bound them to kin who had long stopped speaking it aloud. Most found no welcome waiting. Without family, without sons or daughters to honor their memory, they drifted through the alleys and temples of Beijing, old men with high, brittle voices and eyes that seemed always to look inward, toward a world that no longer existed but refused to die in their bones. In their final years, some of these last survivors spoke to curious journalists, Republican officials, foreign writers who sought to pin their stories to the page before they vanished. They told fragments, of courtyard rituals under moonlight, of whispered words that toppled ministers, of silk robes that weighed heavier than chains. They spoke not with pride but with a flatness born of long practice, men who knew the weight of secrets and the price of telling them. A few stories slipped through the cracks into legend. Tales of hidden treasures buried under marble floors. Of secret tunnels winding out from the forbidden city's heart into the city beyond. Passageways meant to carry a favorite boy to a private garden or to smuggle a disgraced servant to a quiet death where no scandal would stain the throne. Historians search for these tunnels still, but what they find instead are endless layers of locked doors and sealed chambers, spaces that once held laughter, tears, the rustle of silk sleeves in the dark. What remains is the echo, a truth half hidden by official chronicles too careful to write plainly that emperors, for all their power, were often the loneliest men in the realm. And so they surrounded themselves with reminders that every corner of their world could be shaped by will alone. Even the lives of boys taken from far-flung villages, stripped of future and lineage so that the Son of Heaven need never feel the cold alone. For modern eyes, this bargain feels monstrous. Yet within it lay the same contradictions that shaped every empire. Power purchased through cruelty disguised as necessity, loneliness soothed by sacrifice repainted as loyalty. The male concubines of Imperial China were never truly free to choose, yet they were forced to become masters of choosing, how to smile when fear gnawed at their ribs, how to whisper in the right ear at the right moment, how to vanish without trace when the time came to be forgotten. Their lives remind us that behind every story of grandeur, every golden roof gleaming beneath the sun, there run currents too quiet for official scrolls to record. Boys sold to the palace did not leave grand tombs or family lines to carve their names into stone. But they shaped the fates of emperors who believed themselves above the touch of mortal hands. They bent the tide of decisions that rippled out through villages, provinces, entire kingdoms. And they paid for that fragile influence with bodies cut apart, voices silenced when youth faded, names stripped away like old silk burned at winter's end. If you ever stand within the walls of the Forbidden City, beneath the watchful eyes of carved dragons, listening to the wind sigh through gates that once stayed locked to all but the chosen few, remember that history is not built only by the loud proclamations of kings or the sharp strokes of an official's brush. It is also shaped by those whose footsteps left no marks on the marble, whose stories linger only in the shadows that gather at dusk. So we end here, at the edge of a vanished empire's secret heart. May the quiet courage and forgotten suffering of those boys remind us that the cost of power has always been measured not just in coin or conquest, but in the lives quietly consumed to feed the illusions that empires spin about themselves. Thank you for walking this long path through hidden chambers and flickering lamplight with me tonight. Until next time, may the shadows of the past remind us always to look more closely at what lies behind the painted walls and golden roofs we think we understand.